I am up, and many of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Hannah Brakke. I am the Director of Product here at LabKey. And let me make sure, actually, I want to share my whole screen here. And today I'm really excited to talk to you about getting started and really setting up a sample manager to fit your lab. And so we get to hear from both Gwen and Tristan today about kind of how they did that. I know there's a handful of you on the call who have already gone through this process, either with me or with others, but I think it's still a really important thing if you're just starting out, or if you're having trouble getting that adoption or sort of transition into Sample Manager. Providing some help there felt like kind of a strong user need at this point. So the first thing that I really encourage people to do is evaluate your lab. And this is really kind of a thought exercise and where kind of some of that hard work comes in around transitioning into a different system. So the first thing really to consider is the types of samples that you have within your lab. So we saw from Gwen that there's plasmids being captured, other or DNA. You may have other types of samples within your lab, depending on the type of science that you do, of course. Maybe DNA samples or serum or plasma or rocks or trees or pieces of plants. So all of those things are available to you to customize within Sample Manager. And so identifying the types of things that you want to capture within the system is kind of a good first step. And then from there, really going through and identifying the important data that you want to capture for each of those sample types. And that can, again, be very specific for the type of samples that you're collecting or receiving. For DNA, for example, it might be your 260-280 ratio or concentration. Serum might be a little bit different. You might have a collection date or clarity around that serum. And so being able to catalog those things ahead of time in Sample Manager will help you get the structure organized in your head. One of the places that I suggest is if you have an Excel file that your lab has been using, or a paper manifest sheet, or coming from another system, looking at those resources to evaluate what are the different sample types that you've used in the past, and what is the information that you've been capturing on them. And then secondly, really determining those source types and being able to, of course, identify the data that's needed on that. Sources, I think, are a little bit unique to Sample Manager, similar to kind of what Gwen was saying. What we strive to not be is just sort of an auditable Excel. We actually want the system to work for you in ways that Excel and other databases don't naturally do. So capturing where your data is coming from could be sort of considered an actual source. And this is literally like, I grabbed this, extracted this serum from a mouse or a subject, or I collected this pond water from this pond, to be able to sort of capture that information and metadata about the sample. Alternatively, we have a lot of people creating source types as a grouping mechanism. So things like what study is this sample part of, or what client are we generating or testing this sample for, are other good uses of sources. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but the main thing to consider when you're looking at this data, maybe when you're looking at the Excel file, is what redundant data do you have? So if you're looking at your Excel file and you capture information about a patient, and then the study that patient is part of perhaps that's redundant data that you only really need to enter into Sample Manager once. And so getting that structure to help reduce that redundant data entry will really clean things up in the long run and make it a lot easier on your lab scientists, who then don't have to go sort of traipsing through and capturing all of that information at every single step. And then lastly, really just identifying the storage and the different types of boxes or maybe terminal storage that you may have. It looks like Gwen was capturing some agar plates, so there may be some customization that you want to do to capture the types of samples or the types of boxes that you have within your laboratory. And once you've done that sort of mental work to structure that data, it's really time to start experimenting. The great thing about Sample Manager are there are very few things that you can't walk back from. So I really recommend just getting in there and trying it, seeing how things feel. You can always remove fields or add them later. So there's a lot of flexibility with that. We're going to go through this today, actually live on a trial instance where we're going to create source types and sample types, create that storage, and then really import the data and get to work on it and see how that feels once the data is in. So I'll switch over here and I'm going to leave this in this view so I can get the files kind of easily dragged and dropped without having to change my view too much. But we're in a Sample Manager trial that is fairly empty. So I don't have any sources or sample types or assays associated with this trial yet. I have created storage just kind of for ease of demo, but we'll go through and create a new storage unit as well. And so the first thing that I want to show is really creating a source type. And one of the things that I mentioned, it's worthwhile taking a look at sort of current resources that you have available to you. So I'm going to pretend like I had been managing my samples within an Excel file. And we can see here that I have information about DNA samples, that 260-280 ratio that I mentioned, and concentration. I've got the collection date and the amount. I also have where it is in the lab, but then I also have a bunch of information that is maybe more redundant than it needs to be. So for each sample, I'm capturing the mouse, I'm capturing the date of birth and the receive date and the supplier. So, for mouse 1, I'm actually inserting this multiple times. This feels pretty redundant. It feels error prone. It feels annoying to have to do. So what we want to do is actually extract this data and put it in as a source, and then really get that lineage relationship, but then also, reduce that redundant data entry. So to create a source, I'll go to the menu and select Create a Source Type. And I'm going to start by creating my mice source. I have the opportunity to put in a description, so we can say my mice for experiments, something like that. I can also have Sample Manager uniquely identify these mouse for me, or I can also remove the naming pattern and make my users uniquely identify the mice. In this case, I'm going to use a naming pattern, but I'm going to change it a little bit. So I don't want it to be called source. I want it to be a little bit more customized, and we're going to call it mouse then with an auto incrementing ID. This is something that most of you probably know already, but our naming patterns are very robust and very flexible. They're also a little bit hard to get right. So what I really recommend is dream what you want your source to be named or your sample type to be, how you want those samples to be uniquely identified. And then let's have a conversation about it, either through me or your account manager, and we can help get you to that naming pattern that's going to create those unique identifiers for you. The next thing that I want to do is capture the fields or the metadata about the mice that I'm going to be registering into the system. I can see I have a few system default fields here. Maybe in this case, I don't need a description on my mice, so I'm just going to take that out. I already have sort of a pre-formatted file that allows me to drag and drop, and now Sample Manager is going to guess the columns that that I have and kind of map those to fields. So I have a strain and sex and date of birth, supplier, receive date. All of the data types look right for me. So I'm gonna leave all these as is. Steve will get into sort of optionally making things required or not. But we'll just go in and sort of finish creating that source type. I can come back at any point and upload data, but since we're here, we're going to do the data upload as well. So instead of manually adding mice at this point, I still have that file of all the mice that we had sort of pre-Sample Manager. So I'm going to use that to import some new records. And again, I just sort of drag and drop that file and import. And now I have sort of the 10 mice that I want registered within the system. Now that we have those source types, we're really ready to create sample types. So I could go from sort of the prompt on the dashboard or from the menu and go to create a sample type. In this example today, we're really working with DNA. So I'm gonna call this DNA. Again, I have the option to provide a description as well as how I want these DNA samples uniquely identified. In this case, I'm going to customize it a little bit just to say I want DNA with an auto incrementing ID. If I deleted this, then I'd be forcing my users to uniquely identify those DNA samples. So it's really up to you as an administrator on how you want to do that. We have the same option for aliquot naming patterns. So I could name aliquots slightly differently if I needed to. In this case, we're just going to take the default, which is basically just going to add an extra a counter to the end of those DNA samples as they get aliquoted. But I also have this opportunity to add source or parent aliases. And these are really fields that Sample Manager will then look for in my Excel or import files to map to a table within Sample Manager. So if I put in mouse ID here, now instead of having mouse ID as sort of a field within the DNA samples, Sample Manager is going to look for mouse ID and map that to the mice that I just created within the system. And so this is a really great way during migration cases to attach lineage relationships to your samples when you're importing. I can add a label color as well. In this case, we'll just sort of stick with the standard blue for DNA, and of course, assign the units that I want my DNA to be in. In this case, you know, we'll say that we're in microliters. I also now have the opportunity to define the fields or the metadata that I care about capturing on my DNA samples. You can see here we have a number of system default fields. Again, I'm going to sort of select the ones or deselect the ones that I don't think are relevant to my DNA samples. A description or an expiration date are things that I'm just going to take off for now. Again, I can always come back and add that later. I could manually define the fields, or I could use my DNA samples to really define those fields within Sample Manager for me. So I've got a lab ID and that 260-280, my concentration and date collected. I'm checking those data types, and sort of on first glance, all of those make sense to me, so I'm going to leave them as is. I'm also prompted to add a barcode if I need to have a system generated barcode. And so I'm going to say, yeah, sure, I definitely want to barcode these samples. Maybe unlike the previous presentation, instead of using external barcodes, in this case, I'm going to have the system generate barcodes for me. Something to note as well, I can always come back and add that barcode field later, and it will uniquely barcode all of the samples that have been previously registered within the system. So again, sort of that flexibility to grow with the needs of your lab. So we'll finish creating the sample type. I now have sort of the DNA structure in mind, and I'm able to upload data here as well. Before we actually get into this upload though, I want to go and create my storage. So to create new storage, I'm going to navigate to the storage dashboard. I can first sort of look at the current storage units within the system. So I've already customized a few of these here. Maybe I've got Mr. Frosty that doesn't have an XY axis. So bags are really loose structures of how things might be placed within storage, and really a flexible way to track things within a system. Boxes, canes, plates, and tube racks all have sort of XY coordinates. So when I want to add a new box, I actually get to define the number of rows and the number of columns for each of those as well. I can additionally customize this a bit more by adding a description again, or if I really want the labeling of the box to be something different, where we're not doing sort of the row column alphanumeric, but you want to have that switched up because of sort of past usages of boxes, you're able to customize that as well. Once I'm happy with those boxes, I'll go ahead and start to create some storage. Again, I have this opportunity to define if the storage is temperature controlled or if it's room temperature. When it's room temperature, we stop asking sort of the specifics of the temperature and the freezer model, things like that. But this allows me to then create a new freezer. I can assign sort of the manufacturer or the freezer model, and then we'll put this as sort of a -80. I also get to choose where this freezer lives. So in this case, we're going to call it in our South Lake Union building in Seattle. And then, of course, defining that storage hierarchy. So I can drag and drop things here and sort of manually create storage. However, if I have a really structured freezer, I can use this bulk add functionality where maybe I've got some shelves that have 5 racks each. And within each of those racks, I actually have 10 by 10 boxes. This allows me to sort of easily create that structure. And now we can see kind of upon expanding, all of the structure is there. And then I can start to copy this. So maybe in my freezer, I've got 3 shelves that kind of look exactly like this. I'm able to just do that simple copy mechanism and get that same structure for each of those shelves. Sort of finish creating the storage here. And at this point, I really have kind of a brand new freezer that I can add in. Another thing that I could have done was go through if I'm buying a new freezer, or if I have a ton of structured freezers that are maybe structured in the same way, I can actually copy this storage definition as well and create another freezer really, really easily. So we'll just call this, demo freezer, and that structure kind of stays all the same and allows me to quickly create new storage. So now that I have my source types and sample types and storage within the system, I want to start importing data. And we already imported the mice data. And so let's take a look at these individual mice. We've got mouse 1 with the strain and the sex and date of birth. And this will be really important for me to identify how these mice are labeled for subsequent imports of my samples. So if we go back to DNA, we're going to start with a very easy import where I just have an Excel file, and hopefully you guys can see this okay, that literally just has kind of information about that sample and nothing else. So we don't know from what mouse it's coming from or where it is in storage, but we're going to upload this as sort of the first pass. So I'll go to add and then import from file. Again, kind of drag and drop this here. I'll import the data. And now I have new DNA samples. I can choose to sort of directly add them to storage at this point. So if I select add them to storage, I get prompted to put them into some of our free spaces. Maybe we'll go ahead and put it in the user conference freezer. We'll select all of those and add them in. I can then start working with them if I want, but if I look at one of these individual DNA samples, I don't have any of that parent or source information. And so I really don't have any context around where this DNA sample originated from. So what I want to do next is actually add data around these samples that will have lineage. So I've got another Excel file that I have curated that has that same information about my DNA samples. But now this time I have that mouse ID column. And notice that this mouse ID column is the column that I have here as that source import alias. So if I go ahead and do another import, I've got my mouse ID. When I import those samples, they're still not in storage. I still haven't assigned storage during the import. But if I look at an individual sample, I now have that mouse relationship with the DNA samples. And the great thing about this is that I can customize now my grid view to incorporate that mouse data into my view. So if I go into ancestors and start to open up and navigate through here, I can look at the mouse, I can get sort of the metadata about those mice and really capture that here within my grid view. So the next common thing that many people ask me is, okay, well, I want to add my samples, I want to get the lineage in, but I also know where all of these previous samples are in storage. So let me assign that through my file import instead of manually through the system. So this is a file that has kind of that same information around the DNA samples, and now we've included that mouse ID. And then I formatted the storage location to sort of match what we have within the system, as well as what location it is within those individual boxes. And so this is sort of the formatting piece. I actually used the template here to get those columns to create that file. So this is kind of a quick shortcut to format your data in a way that Sample Manager is going to understand. And so now I can go through and add and import from file, drag and drop. I've got sort of that mouse ID as well as my storage locations. And now I have samples that have lineage as well as are in storage at the moment. So this is really kind of the ideal starting point for most of us to be in. And sort of I can call my migration complete at this point. So the next thing I want to show in just the next couple minutes here is really what this process looks like once you've performed the migration and started to use the system, maybe on a more regular basis. So if I get in maybe a new litter of mice, I'm going to go ahead and add those manually. So I'm trying to get myself out of Excel. I haven't created an Excel file in this case. I'm going to add 10 new mice. I can choose to sort of bulk update or insert this data. So I'll turn on and we'll say, you know, they're all bulk C mice. Maybe they were all born on the same date. They're from the same litter. They're from the same supplier. We'll say it's sort of the in-house supplier, and we received them today. The only thing that is different between the mice is their sex. So I can go through and sort of type that in, or I've just got a quick way right now where I'm going to say sort of they're male or female. Again, Sample Manager is going to create that source ID for me, so I'm just going to leave it blank. And now I have 10 new mice that I can work with. If I want to do kind of the similar actions where I create DNA from these mice, I'm going to select them in the grid and then choose to create DNA samples. And in this case, we're going to create just a single DNA sample per mouse, but you could do as many as you wanted. And now I go to that sample creation grid. I can see that my lineage is pre-filled out, and I just need to put in sort of the information about the DNA samples. So again, I could go in and sort of manually type these things through. I could use sort of the bulk update to do things. For the sake of the demo, we're just going to go through and copy and paste these in. I get to leave that barcode alone because that's a system generated barcode. I also get to leave that sample ID alone because that's a system generated sample ID. I'm going to finish creating, and then I'm going to add them to storage. And so we'll add them into that -80 that we have, select kind of that first free spot, and add them to the box. And so at this point now, I really have kind of a working system that I can search and find samples for. For example, if I'm looking for mice, I can go to, or samples from given mice, I can go to my mice grid, look at an individual mouse, and we can see that we've got 20 DNA samples created from this mouse. We've got the lineage associated with that, as well as a list of those samples and their locations in case we want to do something. And I can really sort of get to work in that capacity. So we'll switch over now and take some questions in the couple minutes remaining here, and then I'll introduce Kristen.
All right, so Hannah, one of the questions here in the Q&A, is there any scheduler feature to import samples automatically at a scheduled time?
We don't have a scheduling feature, although what I might recommend is using our workflow functionality to assign a due date for a given piece of work that you want to accomplish in the lab, and that can then be assigned to someone that shows up on their dashboard as having, you know, work to be done. But I think that's a really interesting idea. The other thing maybe to note is that when I register samples within the system, I could go through and pre-register even before we receive them into the lab, and use sample status as a way to indicate if it's actually in the lab, or if we've just sort of pre-registered it ahead of time, maybe to get a bunch of labels for when those tubes come in, kind of make your work a little bit quicker on the day of receipt.
Another question, is there a way to only show boxes that are open? We have a ton of storage, and clicking through to find an open box seems cumbersome.
Yeah, this is really an active area that we're working on improving. And so being able to navigate users quicker to the places that they care about is very important to us. And this exact thing is something we're working on right now with our UX designers of how we can improve that experience for folks.
And then finally, I bet a lot of people have asked this, are we going to be sharing the recording of the webinar?
Yes, so the recording will be shared, I think via email in a week or so, and so you'll be able to catch this later, especially if you have to leave, or if you want to sort of distribute to other folks in your lab.
Great. And I didn't get a chance to get to all these questions, but we'll be answering those offline, and also we're going to give you a chance to schedule some additional time with Hannah or me for some of those other questions.